Well, welcome to New Ways of Being. My name is Raymond Posch. I'm the host, and we're going to have another really interesting episode today with my guest, Nicholas Pearson. And do you go by Nicholas or by Nick?
I go by Nicholas. Thank you for asking.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining. And I recently did an episode on how crystals have really had a big impact on me because they've raised my subtle energy vibration level quite substantially, and much more than I would have ever guessed would have been possible. But so today, I do want to have a kind of a broad conversation about crystals. I know you're considered to be one of the experts out there. I know you've got several different books. I've got the Crystal Basics book, and is that the most recent one?
Yeah, my Crystal Basics Pocket Encyclopedia came out in early 2023, and it is my most recent release so far.
Okay. Well, at any rate, thank you for being here. And I know that anyone who's into crystals will be interested in hearing what you have to say. But I also, in my podcast, which is called New Ways of Being, I want to give people who are interested in really stepping up into new ways of being in their own life and perhaps even in the world in making a difference, perhaps. Um, I want to help provide them information that they can use. So I will get into a little bit about my recent experiences with it, but I know you've been involved with crystals for a long time. So, Nicholas, yeah, go ahead and tell us about yourself and what brings you to this point in time, your story in your life, and let's start with that.
Thank you. Yeah, so I've been a lifelong rock lover. I was definitely that stereotype of a kid who picked up rocks everywhere I went. Real fancy locations like the grocery store parking lot and gravel driveways. Anywhere there was rock. If it spoke to me, it just had to come home with me. And at a fairly early age, my grandfather, observing this behavior over and over again, he gave me my very first piece of quartz, and all of a sudden, this fairly inert part of the landscape was transfigured into something that was luminous and crystalline and just so magical. It felt like I was holding a magical object, like something that was, tangible and real in one sense, but so seemingly otherworldly that it
Mhm.
couldn't really be real. How could I, get access to this piece of magic? And ever since then, I've never looked back. I've been a collector. I From there, I got the chance to kind of immerse myself in the lore and myth of gemstones. I come from a family that is pretty science heavy on the one side, and so while doing that simultaneously, I was learning about earth science and geology, as much as you can at the ripe old age of 8. And I devoured everything at my reading level and then kept going higher and higher until I just ran out of resources at the local library. And eventually, in my teens, I discovered that this idea of the curative power of gems wasn't just a historical tradition. It wasn't something that existed that folklorists collected and reported on, but it actually was still alive in new forms in the kind of crystal healing sphere that was, still relatively emergent in its modern form. And around that time period, I fell in love with um, the kind of new agey literature all about crystals, and I found it as a really great way to combine my parallel interests of the science of rocks and the folklore and spirituality behind them, because it was also around this time frame that I started to notice trends. when people wrote about iron-rich minerals, they often couched them in similar language, even if it wasn't the same substance or being written by the same person or even on the same continent in the same century. We
Mm.
find these kind of patterns that show up over and over again. When I was when I went to university, I was, or so they say, I was randomly assigned to work at the Earth and Environmental Science Museum on campus. I chose my school for its really prestigious music program, and I knew basically nothing else about it. So when I found out that I'd won the jackpot, I had access to the largest rock and mineral collection in the southeastern U.S. It was just this like amazing feeling to get to work with that collection firsthand. So I really immersed myself in the science of it, so much so that I eventually changed my field of study from music to earth and environmental science. And it just afforded me a chance to find more of those patterns, not just in terms of the ingredients in those minerals, but also in the way they form in their crystal lattices. And from there, I just kind of began exploring my own connections, having those primary experiences, all the while teaching, crystal workshops in my local area, whether it was back
Mhm.
home or, up in Central Florida for school. And, at some point, I did other things. I did the corporate America chapter of my life and eventually sat down to collect some thoughts about rocks and wrote a book. And then I wrote another and another and another. And, here we are. I am really blessed with the opportunity to make this passion of mine that started out as a hobby, something that fuels each and every day of my life. And I get to help other folks have those aha moments and understanding what crystals are and how they work and how we can integrate their blessings into our everyday life.
Well, very good. Well, thank you. And so tell me, how do you know, introduce yourself at when you talk to people? You know, do you describe yourself as a gemologist or what words do you use?
It really depends on my audience. If I'm in the kind of holistic, spiritual spaces, it's pretty easy to describe myself as an author and crystal lover. Oftentimes when I'm kind of interfacing with the general public at large, I might describe what I do as ethnogeology, which, like ethnobotany, looks at the intersection between the human kingdom and the
Oh,
mineral sphere. I will often use terms like integrative medicine and meditation and mindfulness, and rather than just immediately going to the space of crystal healing, because those are more familiar ideas. And I also practice and teach other things. So, I consider them all kind of parallel tracks toward the same fundamental spiritual experience that we're having. But it's really about meeting people where they're at instead of having a specific uh, self-description. I
mm,
try to see what people are familiar with and what they're comfortable with. If I'm just doing the science thing, I go to a gem and mineral show or a trade show and I'm buying from folks who are just into the science, the hobby of mineral collecting, we don't have to talk about anything metaphysical. And I can just be a science nerd and we can collaborate on this unusual morphology or that strange crystal habit or how unlikely the combination of these two substances might be. And that's a great conversation I can have. And then, I can go into those spiritual spaces and really appreciate people's primary experiences of the energy and we'll say the inherent spirit in stone. And I'm equally at home in both of those places.
yes. Okay. I grew up on a farm in Missouri. And as a boy, I just loved being out in the woods. And I used to, like you, I collected rocks. I loved finding unusual rocks and beautiful rocks. And also collected, um, let's see, fossils and Indian relics. Um, and so I got into that at a very young age. And I think I remember, I don't know now who the gift was from, but I received I think for a birthday, it was a box about that big, and it was called a rock collection or something like that, and had like maybe eight or nine different specimens of rocks in it, pretty standard things. And I thought that was really neat. Um, but when you were describing what you do, you made me think of, we have a great, uh, see, it used to be called Museum of Natural History here in Denver. And they had a couple of rooms, that were filled with gemstones and very typically very large crystals. And that's always presented kind of from the perspective of geology and their beauty. Their beauty is a key part of it. And of course, in that environment, they don't say a word about the spiritual side or a healing side or anything like that. But and I have to admit, until very recently, I was pretty skeptical about uh, the ability of crystals to uh, help change a person's vibration frequency or um, heal. And I knew that was, something common that's been true for a long, long time. But it it happened that someone convinced me to give crystal pendants a try. He told me how it changed his life, and so I did. And my interest in it was kind of more experimental. At that point I was really open minded to it, but didn't know if I would feel anything, and it turned out that I did. And so I can talk more about that as we go along. But and I have a completely different perspective now than I had 6 months ago, I think. Um, and so I'm kind of gotten into it, and in fact, I'm making crystal pendants now and selling them myself. I just started doing that this week, in fact, and I'm selling them, and I I have bits and pieces of knowledge about the crystals, but what I do know is that they, I guess I would say, are energy amplifiers. They help somebody, if they're open to it, attune to the crystal frequency. Would be that be the way you say it?
So I really like to look at what makes a crystal and observe how we can maybe map out the way they interact in a very material kind of sense as a model for understanding the subtle energies involved. So I think to really unpack the big picture stuff that crystals do, we have to first understand what is a crystal. And a crystal is usually a solid substance. There's some wiggle room there, but we'll have that conversation another time. But generally, a solid substance that has a
Mhm.
repeating symmetrical structure. We call that state coherency. The repetition of it is sometimes called periodicity, but this structure is symmetrical. So
Right.
always the same kind of geometry through and through, and repeats to fill all the available space, usually bound by regular planes and faces. And it must have a regular composition. In other words, it's always the same ingredients. Again, there's a small amount of wiggle room here because nature's perfectly imperfect. But when we start to look at the regularity, the kind of rhythmic nature of a crystal's structure, the sheer perfection of its crystallinity, we start to understand something about how it behaves in a material and an energetic sense. So crystals, by being perfectly harmonic, every um, molecule, every atom they're in, every ion they're in, is aligned in such a way as to contribute to this greater mosaic of perfection, then their primary function is bringing things into a similar sense of equilibrium or harmony. We call that the state of coherence, wherein all the little parts and pieces are like marching in step, perfectly
Right.
in sync with one another. And when a field, when a energy body, we could say, when an energy phenomena is perfectly coherent, what tends to happen is its amplitude is also increased. Now, in the kind of spiritual world at large, we often talk about frequency. We seldom talk about amplitude. Frequency
Right.
is, in short, the number of cycles that repeat in a given sine wave. We usually map out those energies as kind of like a squiggly S-shaped line, but it's the number of cycles within our given unit of measurement. So if it's hertz, it's the number of those squiggles it makes per second.
Right.
Megahertz, the thousands of numbers of those per second. Um, but frequency is akin to the station on the radio. Amplitude, however, is how tall that squiggle is, how far from center that wave extends when we map it out, and that's like the volume of the signal. Now, when two of these vibrating fields, when two of these energy phenomena interact, what tends to happen is that the field that has the greater amplitude can entrain or teach the lesser amplitude, the quieter field, to come into harmony with it, to become similarly cohered by its own map. Now, human beings, we're pretty darn incoherent, and I'm only talking in terms of
Yeah.
physics here. Um, but we are a sum total of vibrations that come from every little bit of us, from
Right.
the subatomic level out to the macro level of every organ and system in our body. And they necessarily have to be different and on their own schedule and produce their own energy signatures, or we don't have everything it takes to be alive. But there are plenty of studies that show that when the coherence of our electromagnetic field, particularly with our heart and brain as the key drivers of this that get measured, when those two things sync up and become coherent, that tends to be either a precursor to, a cause of, or caused by a state of health. Science is really clear on being sure not to insist on causality when we can't prove it, but definitely there's a correlation between this energetic coherency and what we experience as well-being. And so by this same model, crystals, which are incredibly coherent structures and therefore going to produce incredibly coherent energy fields, when we come into harmony with them, we become similarly harmonized. The side effect of that is the higher amplitude comes with syncing up with that. So we could say that amplifying is the side effect of harmonizing in terms of what crystals do.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, and let me ask a question about amplitude. So, and you gave the example of volume, but would that would power be an equal word? And greater amplitude represents some type of greater power, electrical or electromagnetic, or
I think there are a couple ways that we could read into that. We have to also remember that wavelength is something that is a measurement we take, and the shorter the wavelength, the more bits get packed into that wave. So I would say that maybe power is an expression that we might colloquialize to represent that amplitude, but it may not be representative of just amplitude of itself. Personally, I think when people have powerful experiences with crystals, it's not about a discrete energy that we can measure, and instead
right,
about our collaboration with them. Something is powerful because it is meaningful,
right.
because it has value to us on an individual level, and for that to take place, there are two parts to that conversation. The power happens relationally and not because of, in inert measurement that we take and map out.
Yes, you're right. And so I think we should say here, you brought it up in your introduction, I think, about subtle energy, but there is, I think, a level of energy, if I understand this correctly, in crystals, or at least in some crystals like quartz, where the vibrational energy can be measured. But much of the effect of crystals is subtle and cannot be measured scientifically, um, as I understand it. Is that the way you would say it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, everything that we can experience, everything with form, and I don't just mean physical form, but the things that exist in the universe, uh, have both material or matter-driven components, and then they also have this kind of energetic state. Great example, if we look at an electron orbiting the nucleus of any atom, literally anywhere in the cosmos, we can find and measure the mass of a singular electron, or we can observe it as a probability cloud that is nothing but energetic potential. Same with
Right.
photons. They can be discrete particles with mass, or they can be waves that propagate as energy. So matter and energy have this, long-standing interrelationship. So therefore, everything is energy.
Yes.
Um, but not all of the energies that we might experience in our spiritual practice are the same kind of energy. Now, energy's definition is pretty vague. I actually love how vague it is because it leaves the door open for other things.
Uh-huh.
A pretty good working definition of energy from, a physics or science-based perspective would be the capacity to do work. We might qualify that by saying that energy can be measured, and that in many cases, energy can be transformed from one state to another or transferred from one object or system to another. But fundamentally, it is just the capacity to do work. And so if we exist in matter, we have gross energies or measurable energies, but we also exist in spirit, where things are so subtle we can't detect them with any tools or techniques that science has currently developed. That doesn't invalidate their existence. It just means we can't measure them.
Right.
So what I like to do is look to what we can predict or measure or experience and observe from the gross energy as a model for how the subtle energies are also going to work. I can't prove the existence of subtle energy, but I also can't disprove their existence. So I have to assume if they are also the capacity to do work, they have to behave like other kinds of energies and other kinds of systems. And that's why I really like looking toward the physical and chemical and electromagnetic properties of crystals to better understand what might be happening at that subtle level.
Okay. Good. Now I think you uh are kind of like me. I grew up, I loved learning, but I was very logical, very left brain oriented. Although I got into music pretty heavily, starting when I was in my teens, and I still am. Still a musician and entertainer right now, a folk singer for seniors, and I love that. But um, I where am I going with this? I think uh, I had a very practical, real world kind of view of crystals. But now when I look at the spiritual side, I do believe that they have some profound effects in spirituality, and that they have an ability to heal as well. And so, but do you come at this from do you consider yourself an intuitive?
Yeah, and honestly, I would say that my story is almost the opposite in some ways.
Okay.
I began with these really mystical experiences, this
Ah,
sheer state of wonder, almost like a state of communion with
ah,
crystals. Before
ah.
before I knew that was a thing other people had, I just quietly kept that to myself. I was, the weird quiet boy who talked to rocks. And it was only later, like really applying myself to the world of science. I eventually left school without a degree, but you can take the boy out of academia, but you can't take the academia out of the boy, so to speak.
Mhm.
So I appreciate the lens that gave me. I appreciate over the years that I've developed, we'll say, a healthy skepticism, because that allows me to really look beyond confirmation bias and some other things. But at the end of the day, the primary personal experiences are what have always driven my work. And those are the things that I hope to lead other people towards, or to encourage for other people to develop themselves. Because if everything was numbers and data and graphs and sine waves,
Mhm.
I think crystal healing would be quite boring. But a small understanding of any of that can give us confidence that maybe there's something to what we're doing. And I really do my best to kind of straddle the we'll say the mystical and the mineralogical, or the spiritual and the scientific, because it's in that space of overlap that we start to realize that science, with all of its measurements and data and empirical observation and predictions, is ultimately trying to do the same thing that spirituality, with its focus on personal gnosis, is also doing. And that's helping us understand where we are in the grand scheme of things, how we relate to the world around us. And both are valid ways of attempting to do that. And ultimately, for the majority of human history, science and spirit were not necessarily such separate things, and were in fact part of a more cohesive understanding of the world around us when they worked together.
Huh. You know, I recently interviewed a couple named Gail and Greg Hogue. I don't know if you're acquainted with them. And they published a book called Sacred Geometry. And in that conversation with them, in a similar way, I knew nothing about sacred geometry. Uh, couldn't really see how it relates to life. The real world life or spiritual life. And in that conversation, they explained how that the structure that is represented, or that is in fact uh, even understood scientifically throughout all levels of matter, uh, reflect themselves in how the universe operates. And so that was very interesting discussion and fairly eye-opening to me. So, and it helped me understand a bit more about crystals and how that applies. Now they go beyond that, and they talk about how geometric structures and principles in the physical world, uh, or in the human world, uh, apply as well, and why they matter. So I thought that was interesting because I didn't really, until then I wasn't clear about how it tied together, and I love what you're telling us too. That really helps to understand that the two aren't separate things. The spiritual, people like to separate the practical and the spiritual and say they don't mix. But in reality, the spiritual is a outcome or of the physical, or the other way around. The inner aspects of the universe uh, are there as matter is created. So I think it's interesting, and I love the way you kind of bridge both sides. So that's terrific. Um,
Thank you.
are you wearing a crystal pendant today?
I've got a few necklaces on, so I'm wearing some gem quality citrine, some rhodonite, some leopard skin jasper, which is a type of spherulitic rhyolite, and igneous rock. And those are just three that decided to be the right companions for the work I had to accomplish today.
Okay, good. Yes, and I've got on pendants as well. I've got a mica pendant with a small emerald chip. I've got a selenite crystal with several different small crystals or chips, amethyst, black mica, emerald, and I've got a pendant with an amethyst, a really nice polished amethyst crystal, and a Herkimer diamond. And so I know a little bit about a few, but I know that you know a lot about quite a number of crystals. And I'm wondering how big your collection is at your home.
I think it'd probably be easier to estimate in like poundage than it would be by number, just because over the years, especially when I was a young collector, you collect a lot of little things.
Mhm.
And these days I've shifted my focus to, larger pieces. So that means I tend to buy fewer if they're larger and more expensive than I would if they were lots of little things. But I have a pretty egalitarian love for the world of rock and mineral, and I have some pretty humble things sitting on my desk right now, alongside some like museum quality specimens. And one is not inherently more precious to me at the soul level, even though it might be more precious from an economic level. So I think part of my journey is just finding that wonder in everyday rock and stone. And that's been a really big lesson for me lately. We have some really interesting conversations in the world of spirituality and society at large, but specifically in the world of crystal healing, about like the ethics of extraction and mining and the implications of how things get to us. So seeing those kinds of great conversations and participating in them in myself has really encouraged me to like start looking for the humble rocks, like what's right beneath our feet, what magic is there. Still love my beautiful museum quality specimens, but I also have space for like that little chip of granite you found walking along the
Mhm.
sidewalk when you were, go visiting friends in New England, or whatever it might be. So my collection has a pretty wide, we'll say, breadth and depth to it. Um, there are some things that I collect many, many, many examples of just because I love them so much, and there are other things that were so unusual I could only ever find or maybe afford one.
Mhm.
So, it's a pretty wide, uh, we'll say, set of parameters around what I collect.
Yes. You know, a couple of points here that I'd like to chat a bit about. One of the points is that I interviewed a energy healer or spiritual healer named Julia Marie, and she talked about her Herkimer diamond and how that helps her uh, in psychic medium activities that she does, and the healing related to that. But she said to me that when we talked about Herkimer diamonds, she commented that crystals are alive. And that's an interesting statement. And in a book that's very significant to me, which is called um, Conversations with God, Book 4 by Neil Donald Walsh, Awaken the Species, um, God explained in that book that consciousness is in everything. And I believe that, and materialists would have a very difficult time understanding that statement. How can you say uh, consciousness is in a rock? But I believe it's true. And I believe there can be a very personal kind of connection with specific uh, crystal specimens. Now, do you feel the same thing?
So for all of the fancy science and everything else that I enjoy, at the heart of it, I often describe myself, my spiritual practice, as hinging around the identity of being a kind of feral animist. I do believe that everything has a consciousness, that everything has an indwelling spirit. I don't necessarily think that um, we have to, we'll say, strip down the notion of life to only things that are biologically alive. But we also have to be careful to not project human consciousness and
Right.
human ideas onto the inhuman world, or maybe we could say the more than human world. So for me, rocks are very much alive. They very much have personality, not in any biological sense, although there are some pretty cool processes in rock and mineral formation that sometimes resemble, at least metaphorically, things that happen in our own biology. They're definitely, from an environmental perspective, they're abiotic factors. They're non-living things. but spiritually, I mean, they represent the same kind of evolutionary impulse that our own soul is seeking to fulfill and achieve, to let our own brilliance shine. If we look to the Buddhist teachings to the Dharma, we've got this notion of the Buddhakaya, the body of the Buddha is present in all things. The mind of the Buddha is collectively in all of our thoughts. And we see in forms of like Western esotericism, um, with like the Hermetic teachings, the principle of mentalism. We are all ideas in the mind of God, and therefore we all are one in that. So if the same divine mind, the same spiritual blueprint can dream up me and you and this computer and every rock and mineral and every bird and tree and creature, then we're all filled with that same indwelling force, that same spark, that same animating something that gives us a sense of identity. But I think the human paradigm is uniquely human. The Ruby paradigm is uniquely Ruby. The great blue heron is uniquely that. So we shouldn't necessarily conflate um, life and soul and consciousness as being inherently human, but as people, it is helpful to personalize things, just so we can relate to them better. So as long as we're willing to recognize a little bit of bias in there, there's no real problem in doing that. But yeah, I definitely believe that there is a living quality to all of creation, both physical forms and beyond physical forms.
Okay. So um, now I've really, since I started getting into crystals, I've felt a very strong intuitive calling uh, to certain crystals. And so I don't know if there's any intentionality in it, like the crystal is calling out to me, or more a higher level intelligence or consciousness directing me to a specific crystal for a reason that, a knowing that it would benefit me. Like, for example, I had a very strong calling with this particular specimen, which is a large Herkimer diamond. It's not a perfect kind of Herkimer by any means. And for those who don't know, a Herkimer diamond is not a diamond; it's quartz. But and this one has a lot of I don't know. I'm not clear about what it is. Uh, Fractionalization or something that makes it far from perfectly clear. And it's also still in a matrix of dolomite. Um, and I've really felt that it has this specific relationship to me of being very broad spectrum uh, from both minerals, dolomite and quartz, that really, like at a chakra level, extends from earth chakra to soul chakra. Um, and I can feel it in different circumstances in a strong way. There's a feeling there as well. But yeah, comment on the what attracted me to that specific, because I saw a picture. I was going strictly from a picture on a online website, and I saw that it wasn't a perfect Herkimer diamond, but for whatever reason, I felt guided to buy that piece. So, how would you think about it?
I think there are so many ways that we build a relationship with stones and other allies. There's not going to be a universal answer that fits every narrative. And I'm really mindful these days in the work that I do to never overinterpret what someone else is experiencing, because I'm at the end of the day, I have my own lived experience, and I don't want to project my stuff onto yours or assume something about what your kind of energetic path is going to look like. But here's some trends that I've noticed from observing others and myself for 3 decades doing this kind of work. Um, Oftentimes, we feel a strong inclination toward a kind of crystal because it can represent either a short-term or long-term goal or milestone that we're working towards. Sometimes we are guided toward a crystal because its unique personality is somehow akin to ours. You know, we are here to fulfill similar things. Sometimes you can like something just because you like it. Uh, my husband, his favorite color is blue. Lapis lazuli is one of his favorite stones because that rich ultramarine blue is something he loves, and it started there, and then it went farther. Other times we're attracted to something because of like a deficit that we might have energetically, emotionally, spiritually, physically. I've known I've known people with iron poor diets really like mysteriously drawn toward things that had iron in them, and not just the obvious iron oxides and iron sulfides like our hematites and gotites and pyrites and limonites and such, but some pretty off the beaten path kind of iron minerals, not knowing what was in them. I've seen folks who are myself included, really like almost as if against our own will, attracted to a stone that, like, on paper, we can appreciate what it's supposed to do, but nothing about it otherwise feels attractive, and we still feel drawn to it because it represents something we're working on. Now, the flip side of this is the stones that we're drawn to. What about the stones we aren't drawn to? What about the ones that maybe we're actively repelled by? And again, there's no universal answer that kind of fills in the dots. If for many of us, we're drawn to crystals because they're complementary to our soul's experience, sometimes we feel, I'll say, a little bit of dynamic tension around the crystals whose energy or missions or goals are totally foreign to our everyday
Huh.
experience or existence. And that's not inherently a bad thing. Sometimes
Right.
we get drawn to a crystal because it feels like coming home. But if we stayed in the house all day, how much growth are we really going to do? It's that crystal whose energy is so far outside of us that it's uncomfortable that can sometimes bring immense growth. Other times we're actively repelled by something because it's just not the right one for us.
Right.
So there's even a spectrum there, and no one size fits all answer, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I love the way you explained that. And I think this is it's very helpful for me to hear from someone very knowledgeable and, um, you're at a level of experience and perspective that, you see that it's not, there's a tendency to try to oversimplify things when it's probably not right to do that. We need a broader perspective and understand that there can be many different factors at play uh, in relationships, such as between people and crystals. But yeah, I've got another one that I really like that I bought from the same guy that I got the Herkimer diamond, and it's a very, I don't know if I light is right, but a very attractive specimen of pyrite. Um, and somehow it just really strongly appealed to me. First of all, it's quite beautiful. Um, but so let's see, I've got some other questions I want to ask you. Well, let's talk a little bit about one of the things that impressed me in your book that I would not really have thought about or really related to was you talk about correspondences. And so, yeah, talk about that a little bit because after reading what you wrote, I began to have a better appreciation that many different factors could be at play. And there are many different correspondences that you talk about, their crystalline structure, their color, and other their how they originate out of the Earth's crust, and etc. So yeah, go ahead and tell us about that.
Yeah, so this idea of correspondences, at least in terms of like modern parlance, we take that notion from the Hermetic principle of correspondence. That's where the famous line "as above, so below" comes from.
Right?
But ultimately, it's rooted in quite an old tradition. We see it expressed in herbalism and in other places as the doctrine of signatures, which to oversimplify here, tells us that we can identify which kinds of plants or medicines might correspond to which parts of the body or which ailment by their general characteristics, their appearance, their scent, all kinds of stuff. And this has been true of working with crystals for a very long time. Um, so in the work that I do, I really love going beyond the surface level. I'm sure anyone listening to this conversation has probably figured that out by now. I like to dive in deep. And for many of us starting our crystal journey, the first system of correspondence we learn is color. And we learn that there is a symbolic language to color, which oftentimes in a pocket-sized book like the one I wrote, we have to simplify and universalize and kind of prescriptivize, if you will,
Yeah.
just because there's not space in that for a larger conversation to be had. A common way of organizing color is with the modern Western chakra system, with our seven energy centers and those
Right.
seven colors corresponding, which is, of course, an ancient and mystical practice, so long as we believe that the year 1977 is ancient and mystical, which is when that system really came together. The chakras themselves are older. They looked quite different to our modern Western idea of it. And that's not good or bad. That's just the way it is. It's
Right.
a model. It
Right.
is the nature of the soul can't be reduced to a two-dimensional map, but we can use
Right.
that map to explore it. So correspondences are one way we'll say, orient our work with crystals on whatever map or model makes sense for us. So, the color crystal chakra correspondences are one thing that we can do. In like historical literature about stones, we see a lot of these kind of more cosmic correspondences where we connect them to specific heavenly bodies, the main planets and luminaries, sun, moon,
Right.
Mars, Venus, and so on and so forth, as well as the signs of the zodiac. This tradition actually goes back very, very far, almost to the very beginning of the written record about rocks. We see these kinds of correspondences being produced in civilizations like Babylon, Sumeria, so on
Mm.
and so
Hmm.
forth. And we begin with these kind of planetary correspondences that evolve into zodiacal ones, which eventually becomes our modern system of birthstones. But over the uh, just lots of observation, lots of inner work that I've done, lots of comparing notes to others. I've also developed correspondences based on the kind of geological principles in our stones. What do the primary formation processes, igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic, correspond to energetically? What symbolism do they confer? What language do they speak on the symbolic level? Same is true with the primary mineral forming elements, which is a really big conversation. You can't fit the whole periodic table in a pocket-sized book, so it's not in this one, but I do have a section on that in my larger book, Crystal Basics, which came out in 2020. I talk about the crystal systems, the seven primary ways that we organize um, minerals on a like geometric level, and what kind of energetic language they might speak symbolically, and so on and so forth. So I enjoy allowing those to be lenses that give us insight in the different aspects of a crystal. Just like we could say, oh, well, I am from Florida. I wear glasses. I'm a redhead. I'm a polyglot, whatever it might be. Those are lenses into my identity, but they don't tell the whole story, no one by itself. But if we use all of those correspondences to paint a more holistic picture, then we might be able to understand the mission a crystal has, its predisposition to assisting us in certain endeavors or in certain areas of life. And of course, that is still just a snapshot. There will be more to that story that we only get by direct experience, our own personal gnosis. So, whether we're using color or whether we're using astrological correspondences or elemental or geological ones, we should think of them as one of many doorways into understanding a crystal's energy, and then be willing to be pleasantly surprised by how much more is under the surface once we get there.
Hmm. Yes. Thank you. Um, Now, in your book, the one that I have there, you talk about for for a number of different crystals, 400 some, I think, of almost 500 in that particular book, and you list a set of healing properties and psychological healing properties and spiritual or metaphysical properties. When it comes to that, I have to ask the question, how do you gather that kind of information and have a level of trust in it? And so one aspect or one way would be uh, by kind of historic uh, viewpoints about it from many different people. You know, but also I would want to ask the question: do you have abilities to intuitively read crystals that you have some level of this inner knowing that that's right, that is that particular aspect, that property is probably true generally for a specific type of crystal? How does that work for you, and how did you arrive at it for your book?
Yeah, this is always a fun conversation to have. So how do we know what a crystal does? What is the bottom line answer? And this is an art versus a science. So as much as I want to wear my science hat, I know that really there's a messy artistic process underneath it. And tradition, like you mentioned, the historical record, folkloric records, these are a really important part of informing it. But those are often predicated on an imperfect understanding of what rocks really are. If you read a medieval lapidary telling you about sapphire or emerald, they're rarely the things that we think of as sapphire and emerald today. They often refer to other things that are very simply blue and green rocks. That was all it took to be a sapphire or an emerald. It just had to match the color. So, we have to read those with a lot of nuance. We have to be willing to engage with the text and negotiate with what it's telling us to really understand what's happening underneath the surface. And then having a good working knowledge of language and history and geology and geography and all other kinds of things can really help you kind of assess that from the traditional perspective. Now, a lot of that directly informs our modern crystal healing movement. We've got a handful of like early 20th century works that would kind of become a platform for folks in the latter half of the 20th century to start to understand what gemstone energy is. But the challenge is that we have named and discovered and made accessible a whole lot more rocks and mineral species than we knew about before. So if there is no ancient reference to labradorite, because only in the last century did it get a name,
Mhm.
how do we know what labradorite does? And there are a few ways that we can do this. One of which is to have our own personal experience with that stone. And I
Right.
think that's what a lot of crystal authors, particularly in like the beginning of that crystalline gem craze that really like crescendoed into the 80s and 90s, even into the early 2000s, people would find rocks that nobody had written about. And so they had to have their own personal experience. They would meditate with it, they would use it in a grid, they would do whatever they were going to do, and then report on that. And that's important if we regard it as data collection. We just have to remember that data generally has a bias based on
Right.
who's interpreting it. Whether we like it or not, we do. I have a bias. I will be the first to admit that in my works.
Right.
So the next step of what I do after tradition is what I consider like literature review. What are other folks saying, and how do we get a trend to emerge from that? But even before I like to look at those two aspects, our we'll say traditional and maybe we could say neo-traditional resources, the new traditions. I want to go have my own experience and I want to see how that compares to what Judy Hall said or Katrina Raphael said or Naisha Azian. I want to see how my experience of lush red garnet compares to what G.F. Koons reported in 1913 when he was drawing from earlier folklore. I
Yep.
want to see how my almost like ritual perspective on emerald compares to what the medieval and ancient authors said on it. Because if I don't have my own framework, then I don't have anything to link up what the others are doing. So all of that kind of comes to a head when you're writing something pocket sized, when it's this big and you got to fit two rocks on every page. You don't get to have a whole conversation about that. You got to distill things down to what is essentially something I try to avoid at all costs, which is prescriptivism, because we have to pick out some meaningful keywords. And hopefully those keywords hold true for our personal experience. Hopefully they represent the historic and modern traditions. And also hopefully they give people practical advice. So when it came time to distill all of that for the 450 stones in this, I had to take a step back and go, okay, if all of these people have so much to say, if my own experience is so big, what what are the most important takeaways? What are the things that drive all the other things? And
Mhm.
we could use maybe something like citrine as a great example of this. It's this brilliant yellow variety of quartz that I'm wearing around my neck for those of you who can see the recording. Citrine is often described as a merchant stone, a stone of abundance, a stone of wealth. And while I do experience it in my own life as being helpful for those things, the deeper we go with citrine, the more we start to realize that that is like the surface level goal of what it does. And there's all this stuff beneath that that drives that experience so many people write about. And for me, citrine's like deeper function is essentially twofold. One of which is strengthening and enhancing our ability to let go. We might describe that as, physiologically, if we wanted to make a correspondence there, we might describe its function as being related to our systems, our organs of elimination, but also mentally, like being able to let go, to eliminate the burdens that don't serve you. But what happens when we empty out the box? We can fill it with new things. So the second half of what citrine does isn't attracting new things, but instead helping you fulfill your life's purpose. Because a fulfilled human being is going to have an abundance of resources to support them. And that's not just monetary abundance, which we often limit citrine to, but it's like the big picture of what prosperity might look like. It's an abundance of social and emotional and spiritual resources. It's having
Mhm.
enough food. It's having enough fulfillment at the end of the day. And when we take that step back and see citrine through that lens, it's hard to reduce it to just being about money.
Right.
So a large part of what I do is trying to find that that conversation between what appears to be the wheels that make everything else turn
Yeah.
and being able to give that, in this particular book, in as short a version as possible. So I'm really drawing from a lot of resources. I'm cross-referencing to things composition and structure, and using my own little system of decoding those correspondences along the way. But for a pocket encyclopedia, we do have to make it a quick resource. It has to be, bite-sized bits of info. So a lot goes into choosing any of those words.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for that. And that makes total sense to me to get down to the more basic uh, aspects, functions and properties, characteristics. I'm struggling for the right words, but the more basic, our umbrella for more specifics, as you say. We shouldn't just, when we talk about abundance and prosperity, we shouldn't be looking just in terms of money, but of life itself and all its aspects. So a beautiful example. We're really out of time here, but I've got to ask one more question. Now, I happen to run into a very interesting experience with learning how to measure my own personal energy frequency with muscle testing. Have you had any experience with that?
Only nominally. It's definitely not we'll say the system that I use most often in my life.
Okay, so definitely not, huh? But do you have a way that you measure your energy correspondence to a specific crystal?
There are a handful of ways. So if we use things like muscle testing and applied kinesiology, there are some, like, we'll say, softer methods that I will teach people. Things like I call a pull-in test that I learned in my gemstone energy medicine training. If you take a gem, crystal, rock, or mineral that you want to work with, and you hold it roughly equivalent to where the manubrium is, that little divot in your clavicle that's slightly higher than your thymus gland, which is kind of like an energetic window into your energy fields. If you hold something out there and frame the question that is meaningful, is this the right crystal for me? Is this the one I should buy? Whatever the question is, frame it in the most holistic and meaningful way you can. And you can kind of gently pull and see if you get any resistance along the way. Sometimes I start that process and it feels like two magnets just pulling toward me. I'm
Uh,
exaggerating that movement. Other things that I will teach people involve visualization. Some folks like to use dowsing, and we'll use pendulums or dowsing rods to measure energies. However we do this, we have to recognize that oftentimes our psyche plays the most important role in this, and it
mhm,
is very easy, even without meaning to influence the results that we get.
mhm. Yep.
So we just need to be mindful to have a healthy, almost like clinical distance between us and the question and the end result of said question. Because if you really, 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 really want that piece of rose quartz to be the right one for you, that's the answer you're going to get, whether it's muscle testing,
Right.
dowsing, or any of these other things. So I find myself these days um, just coming up with, my short list of contenders. Day before yesterday, great example. I thought I knew what I was going to wear out into the world, and I start putting it over my head, and the little voice in the back of my head says, "Hey, Nicholas, why don't we check in?" And sure enough, the reaction I got was almost like a gentle repulsion when I use that kinesiological technique. So, I think it's good, whatever we do, to be open-minded to the end result, and like I said earlier, be willing to be surprised. I'm often willing to be wrong about what I think the answer ought to be, and as long as I do that, I'm open to a contrary dialogue, and that's really important.
Yes, thank you. And I think the same thing is true in muscle testing as well, and particularly with muscle testing uh, on by ourselves. If there's a second party involved that's helping, then it changes it a little bit. But well, thank you for that explanation. Nicholas, this has been a great conversation. This has been a perfect conversation for me to hear right now. And I hope it's been a perfect conversation for my listeners as well. What I love about life is there's always something new to be learned, and the learning process is a fantastic part of life. So, and I appreciate your experiences, your viewpoints, and everything that you have brought to the table. So thank you for being here. My guest here today is Nicholas Pearson, and go get one of his books if you're interested in crystals. It's a great resource. Any final words you'd like to add, and also give us your website?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me on the show, and thank you to everyone who is watching or listening. I really do appreciate the chance to connect with all of you via this platform. If you'd like to learn more about my work, you can find resources for all the stuff I do over at my website, which is theluminouspearl.com. It'll send you links out to my social media. You can sign up for my newsletter. You can check out upcoming events, and you can also look at all of the books that I've got available, as well as some that will be forthcoming soon.
All right. Well, thank you. And for you and my listeners today, have a great day and a great life.